Well, good morning, everybody, and or good afternoon or good evening, depending on what part of the world you're in. Um, Here in Ecuador, it's morning time, so good morning. First, I'd like to welcome everybody and to thank Ashton and Matt for inviting me to share my thoughts on what is a complex and difficult, yet very important topic to navigate. I think with the time allotted, and I'm going to try to keep this under 30 minutes. But I think with the time allotted, the best way for me to to present what I want to share about the topic is through a story. So let us begin. Some of you may be familiar with the Midwestern Great Plains of the United States, and if so, you may know about the giant cottonwood trees that grow throughout the region. The tree gets its name from the seed pods that burst open in late spring, early June, and fill the air with millions of snowy, cotton-like seeds. And some days it can look like a snowstorm. But in any case, these can sometimes fly for miles on the warm spring currents before landing. Most will eventually perish, but some will land in places where they will sprout roots and go on to grow to be the giants that people here or people in the Midwest come to know them for. Some of them live long enough to see great changes in the world around them uh, and can live to be well over 100 years old. So this story is about a seed that, not unlike the cottonwood seed, was carried by the proverbial winds of space and time to land in the hands of a Midwestern African American teenager. That seed was a book, Knowledge of the Higher Worlds and Its Attainment. The place was North Omaha, Nebraska, and the time was 1972, and I was that boy. I was a child of the 1960s. For those of you who are too young to remember, it was a very radical time, not just in the United States, but around the world. Like many young people of that time, I was idealistic and rebellious and revolutionary, distrusting of all things status quo and white establishment. The 60s were a time that gave birth to strong desires for alternative lifestyles and alternative ways of seeing the world. Social protests grew into social movements. The anti-war movement, the civil rights movement, uh, women's rights movement, even though women's rights movement had been in effect for many years, uh, the 1960s produced a number of well-known feminist writings. Uh, the fight for the rights of migrant workers and indigenous people, uh, the environmental movement, uh, the organic food and biodynamic uh, pesticide-free gardening and farming movement became popular. People started realizing that we live on a planet that's not just a giant rock floating in space, but that it's a living being. Uh, so all of these movements were born during the 1960s, culturally as well, art, music, literature, philosophy, alternative religions were all being explored by these new ways of thinking about the world. It was a very magical time, to say the least, to be a teenager, to be coming of age. For many of us born during that era, there was a sense that there was something large and wonderful about the world looming just outside our cognitive grasp, something that very few of our fathers and fathers' fathers seemed interested in, and certainly weren't talking about. So it was into this climate that knowledge of the higher worlds found its way into my life, as did the Black man from whom I received it. I can say without reservation that that book and that man changed my life and the lives of everyone they touched. I remember that from the beginning, the pages spoke about things I intuitively felt, but didn't know how to describe. It proposed answers to questions I didn't know how to ask. And it did so in a language that was instantly as familiar and welcome as that of my own mother. For me, it was a watershed moment, and indeed a watershed decade. Donnie Simmons was the man who passed the book along to me. He had recently moved back to Omaha from living and working on a biodynamic farm in California. Donnie was a very powerful and charismatic person, and his energy was reflected in his passion for Steiner and anthroposophy and meditation. 5 of us started a study group, and we planted a community biodynamic garden right there in the middle of the ghetto in North Omaha. And we began practicing the meditations in knowledge of the higher worlds. We were all hippies back in 1972. I'm not sure that all of you know the term, but nevertheless, our symbol was the peace, love, dove. And one of our slogans was make love, not war. We also had another slogan, Black is beautiful. In a sense, I've never really stopped being that hippie. What most impressed me at the time about anthroposophy was Steiner's insistence that readers not accept his words on face value, but instead develop the skills necessary to test them for themselves, the tenets of spiritual science. After more than half a century of doing just that, I have found myself in a somewhat unique position, a man of African descent who has validated the ideas and practices put forth by anthroposophy on the deepest spiritual and academic levels. They have not only provided me the wherewithal to withstand the most rigorous tests of my life, and there have been many, but have also inspired and strengthened my ability to speak and uphold truth in the world. Truth that is not always pleasant to speak about, like the story of my good friend Themba Sadiki that I'm going to share with you now. Let me right here. Themba Sadiki was one of the original members of our group. I would describe him as physically a very large man and with very black skin. And emotionally, he was very joyous. He had a gift and a voice that would break out in a moment's notice in song. And he was passionate about art and education and life, and later carried that passion into his work as a Waldorf teacher. Eventually, we all went our separate ways, but some years later, I would run into Themba again, and he was the same joyous soul, the same booming personality that I had known, and it was good to renew our friendship. Then, many years after that, our paths would cross for a final time. By then, he was no longer the Themba I once knew. His large body had grown weak and frail from diabetes, and he never spoke about Steiner or anthroposophy. During one of our conversations, I made some anthroposophical reference, and he seemed surprised. When I inquired why, he said that it had just been a long time since he had contact with any anthroposophist. Again, I asked why. And that's when he told me the story. And it was heartbreaking. Themba explained that he had been deeply involved with the movement, teaching, lecturing, and working happily on theatrical productions of Steiner's plays, both in the US and abroad. He explained that during a visit to Germany and Switzerland, he experienced something in the anthroposophical communities there that caught him totally off guard and forever changed the way he saw anthroposophy, anthroposophists, and Rudolf Steiner. As he described incident after incident, I myself began feeling unsettled. He said that Steiner and many anthroposophists were racist and that white supremacy was one of the pillars of the movement. I didn't want to believe what I was hearing, but what I couldn't help but believe was what I was seeing. Themba had been deeply hurt, and his pain was clearly visible. He said that there was no place for people of color like us in anthroposophy, except maybe as minstrels or tokens. I argued that over the years, or I tried to argue that over the years, I read hundreds of Steiner's lectures and books, and that I had never read anything that supported his conclusion. He then quietly directed me to some publications and told me to keep reading. Then he said something that has never quite left me. He told me to keep reading, and that if I ever had the chance to visit the communities in Germany or Austria or Switzerland, that I should do so and then come back and tell him if I still think Steiner deserves a pass. I stayed in touch with Themba until his death a few months later. That was many years ago now. Since then, I've come to my own conclusion. And no, Themba, my friend, I assure you, Steiner doesn't get a pass from me. The claim of racism was one that as a Black man I had to take seriously, and one that I felt personally responsible for examining with all the vigor at my disposal. I entered the rabbit hole and combed my library of lectures and books by Steiner and spent hours on the then newly established Rudolf Steiner archives online. And I found that most claims of racism were based on a comparatively few statements when taken within the context of a vast number of Steiner's writings. But at the time, I have to admit I was limited by my ability to read the bulk of publications because they were not yet translated into English. Nevertheless, the statements I did encounter were more than enough to justify further investigation. Fortunately, in 2008, an associate professor of history, Peter Staudenmeier, published a paper entitled Race and Redemption, Racial and Ethnic Evolution in Rudolf Steiner's Anthroposophy. And then 2 years later, in 2010, he published Between Occultism and Nazism, Anthroposophy and the Politics of Race in the Fascist Era. Some of you might already be familiar with the book, but if you're not, I have posted both the paper and the book in the chat for those of you who would like to read or investigate further. I've also posted in the chat a number of excerpts from the book that I think will serve to help make my point or serve to illustrate the point that I'm making here today. The book is considered by many, including myself, to be the most authoritative historical work on the subject to date, and has been invaluable to me in providing nuanced and important historical context to Steiner's view on race. Stoudemire traces the evolution of these views from he traces the evolution of Steiner's work from its beginnings when he was a student in Vienna to his later works with German nationalism and German nationalist publications, to his 10-year involvement with the Theosophical Society and the eventual break from that group, and then his starting of the Anthroposophical Society in 1912. Stoudemire examines how the larger social and cultural political influences in turn of the century Germany impacted Steiner's racial and ethnic evolution. So I'd like for you to read those excerpts when you have time, and we will continue on with more about them in our discussion after my presentation. So as you can imagine, it was very difficult for me when I first came across these statements by Steiner and anthroposophists of that day. And I avoided putting some of the more extreme and bizarre comments in the chat, but I put enough there so you can get my drift. Anyway, they were shocking, and they were the type that crushed the hopes and beliefs of Themba Sadiki, someone who had nothing but love for anthroposophy and for the world, and someone who deserved better from anthroposophy. So if my point is well taken here today, then you may be wondering how I can know what I know about Steiner and the racist elements of anthroposophy and still be here with you participating in the work of this group. The answer goes straight to the point I hope to make to you today. You see, those many years ago when Donnie Simmons gave me that old tattered copy of Knowledge of the Higher Worlds, it was like he gave me a map that showed the way to a great treasure. I couldn't know it then, but that map was accurate, correct, and as real as anything I've ever found in the world. It led me to exactly where it said it would, and I found the treasure exactly as it promised. And in the process, I grew to have an intimate relationship with the spirit of Anthroposophy, a relationship that has nothing to do with Rudolf Steiner, the man, or Anthroposophy, the movement. Thankfully, my faith has steered me clear of all of that, so that by the time I learned about Anthroposophy's unfortunate history, I had already had certain fourfold experiences, I'll say, for lack of a better term. Part of my consciousness had already started to awaken, and my relationship to myself and the world was already changing. As a result, I understood that not everything Steiner said was gospel, and not everything was spiritually inspired. Rudolf Steiner was human, and much of what he taught were ideas that were shaped by his culture and his time. But now we live in a different time. This is not 1910 Germany, and we are not 1910 Germans. The true and the good which passed through Steiner into the world, and there was a great deal of that, make no mistake. That has been carried forward. But that which was not true and good has come to light. I think we know the difference intuitively and otherwise. How we acknowledge and respond to that difference, I think, will determine the future of anthroposophy. I also think that we must ask ourselves a question. Is there really a place in 21st century anthroposophy for ideas as obsolete as racial hierarchy and ethnic purity? When one sees in one's own life, in one's own struggles and achievements, in one's own inner growth, the reflection of the Sophia mission, one is an anthroposophist. Love and reverence for all humanity transcends Steiner and becomes visible, tangible evidence for all to validate on its own merits, to validate in our own lives. When one takes the opportunity to really connect with people of other races, ethnicities, and nationalities, I mean, really connect with them, we come to see and feel the many ways our lives are enhanced. Through the path of love and reverence, Anthroposophia becomes known for what she is, a path to the higher development of all that is humanness. In that light, what flows through us into the world then becomes all that matters. So now let me offer a couple of thoughts on how to free anthroposophy from this historically embedded racism. First, and this is probably the most difficult thing for many people, let's admit that Steiner espoused antiquated racist ideas and that he promoted the belief in white racial superiority. That fact no longer needs to be contested. I think anthroposophists would do well to stop trying to find reasons to give Rudolf Steiner a pass in this regard. It's like looking away from the mirror because you have a lesion on your face and you hope that it will go away on its own if you pretend it's not there. The problem with anthroposophy is that its racist doctrines are not just going to go away by pretending they're not there. They need to be acknowledged and confronted. Second, let's stop deifying Steiner the man. I think it's important to keep in mind that even though Steiner was able to see and communicate inspirations from higher planes, and that these inspirations continue to guide humanity towards spiritual realities, he was also a man, a human being. Like all men, he was born into a body with specific personality traits and specific socioeconomic environment, having a specific cultural history and national origin, and that these also shaped his thoughts and actions. Like all of us, he too was bound and defined by his experiences on both sides of the threshold. And as is often the case, the two sides can sometimes become juxtaposed and difficult to reconcile. Error has always been part of what it means to be human. And In my opinion, regarding race, Steiner simply erred. As I've already stated, one of the first things that attracted me to his writings is that he always insisted that no one ever accept his words without question, without investigation. Instead, he urged us to test and determine the truth for ourselves. He simply provided a map and a few cognitive tools. For me, that was more than enough to find my own way. And to this day, the most important tools in my spiritual toolbox are still the anthroposophical meditations. The greater the degree to which I bring my life into harmony with my inner voice through meditation, the greater the degree I connect with a form of wisdom and knowledge, ancient in its origins, multicultural in its manifestations, that lead me ever closer to my goal of freedom. So, in closing, because I don't want to go too long, I would just like to say that each day, new revelations dawn upon us. We face the world totally aware of the spiritual foundation of our lives and of the universe. We are connected to that foundation and to each other, not in any theoretical or illusory way, but in a way that informs our thoughts and actions in the most practical sense. To an even greater degree, meditation is the fountain from which intuition renews itself and from which inner calm and courage can always be summoned in pursuit of greater love in the world. But more than that, having unlocked the gate between physical and spiritual reality through our practice, we understand the full value of our freedom, and we recognize the source of the inner voice that draws us toward that freedom. That voice, it turns out, was the song of our souls all along. That's what anthroposophy is. That's why I'm still here. We must be as honest about that as we are about our responsibility to evolve anthroposophy beyond the shortcomings of individual personalities. In drawing upon the diverse contributions of the entire world, of all that the world has to offer, the spirit of anthroposophia will move us all ever closer to our goals. So again, I thank you, Ashton and Matt, and all of you for this opportunity to present a few of my thoughts on the matter. And now we should open this up for discussion among the group.